All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 9th Annual Wisconsin Winter Web Conference. I am Jean Anderson with the South Central Library System, and I am moderating the management track today. Excuse me. Assisting me today is Ann Hamlin from the Wisconsin Valley Library Service, and we are so glad to have you here today. Our presenter for this session is Jennie Garner, Director of the North Liberty Library in North Liberty, Iowa, and she will be presenting Nitty Gritty Policy Makeover. If you have questions during the webinar, ask them anytime, and I will be passing them along to Jennie during the webinar. So Jennie, whenever you are ready, go ahead and take it away.
Good morning. I am Jennie Garner. It is snowy in North Liberty. We also had that snowstorm yesterday. I think Jean's told you pretty much what you need to know about me. I will tell you that I've worked at the library here in North Liberty for 25 years. This year, in March, actually, is my 25th anniversary at our library in multiple roles. Before I was a librarian, I was a volunteer, which just helped me to rediscover my love for libraries before I started as director 5 years ago. I was assistant director, and before that, I was teen librarian. So I've been in several different roles at the library. My affinity for policy started a long time ago when I was assistant director, but even before that, I feel that affinity is a really weird word to use with policy. Nobody loves policy, but I like what policy does. So our library staff, we have 17 staff members. When I started at the library, there were 3 of us. So we've grown from a town of about 4,500 when I moved here in the 90s to over 20,000 today, so very rapidly, which meant that we also had to rapidly adapt and adjust, and policy helped us in many, many ways. My staff of 17 is 10 full-time and 7 part-time members on our team, and each one of our staff have the decision-making power when it comes to customer service. That means that if they're at the desk and something seems like they should tweak it, then they tweak it. They don't have to come ask me. They don't have to check with the supervisor. They make a decision. And the reason I did that when I became director in 2014, I had a goal to create a service model that allowed our staff to help each patron who walks through our door with the experience that they're looking for every single time. I wanted them to reach the outcome that they were seeking whenever they came in on any given visit. And I wanted to empower the staff to provide this service in the moment that strong policies can do. And so we worked really hard through our policies. At that time, we had a lot of policies, which I'll talk about later, and narrowed them down and tightened them so that they work for both our staff and our patrons. My disclaimers, I am not an expert on policy by any means as far as policy writing goes, but I do like, as I mentioned, what policy can do for us in the library world, and the opinions that I express here today just stem from my work on our policy manual and articles and research that I've done over the years. I'll tell you a little bit about our process that we use to change our policies to what we feel is a really efficient and effective way for our staff to be empowered to make those decisions that are positive for them and for our patrons, and help us not get boxed in by rules. To me, flexibility and fluidity is the key to policy making. And while our public libraries follow a lot of standards and tenets as we deliver service, and how we operate as guided by our state agencies, our library associations, our fellow librarians, and other resources, we also know that respective communities differ very much. So what might work in your community might not work in someone else's. So keep that in mind as I tell you this. If you're thinking, what in the heck is going on there? It might not all work the same in every town, but I hope that what I provide today will help you just kind of guide you through some basic practices. I would encourage you as you develop and write your policies that you consider equity and inclusion a huge focus. We do that with every policy. We want to make sure that we're serving every person in our diverse public that comes in, and how we keep our staff welfare in mind as part of that balance. As we know, public library staff are subject to secondary trauma in the work that we do every day, and we want to ensure that our staff can provide that excellent service and still be backed by good policy. It's really important that as we continually review our policies and update them, that they strike that balance. So first, I was hoping to get a sense. I don't know if in the question, sorry, I am not as familiar with our meeting format at GoToMeetings. So if you guys can just type in a little bit about your populations, different sizes you serve, I would love to know a little bit more. So if Jean, you can chime in and just kind of give me some ideas of a few various peoples.
Sure, I will do that. So just like you did in the before we started, go ahead and in the question box, put your the population served. Is that what you're looking for, Jenny?
Yep.
So we have 17,000, 29,000, 35,000, 70,000, 8,400, 6,500. Oh my goodness, they're coming in fast. 3,500, 20,000, tiny, less than 1,000, 16,000, 1,000, 800, 2,000, 25,000. So it's quite a range. 11,000.
Yeah, a lot of range. So I think keeping in mind that some of your larger libraries and different size libraries are going to be able to do different things with your policy and have some, particularly depending on how your board is structured and your community, what needs you're serving in your community, it might look vastly different. Again, these are just basic ideas and guidelines that I hope that people can use, particularly in creating that balance and the welfare of your staff and your community and making sure that it's inclusive. So I did put up the definition of policy, which I'm not going to read for you by any means, but you can see the red words, which I think is the most important piece here: to guide and determine present and future decisions. It says nothing about the past. Our library policies should be proactive. They should not be reactive. There is one thing that if you ever hear, and I'm sure you all have if you worked in libraries, somebody's saying, well, I have this patron who does this, so I think I'm going to create a policy. Please don't create a policy based on what one person does when they come in your library. And policy should be positive, not punitive. I think we can word our policies in a way that allows us to embrace the public in a way that, and we don't, we as librarians tend to sometimes, I think, we want to be open to everyone, but sometimes when it gets down to these things like fines or rules, we tend to get a little bit restrictive. Sometimes, I hope we don't, but sometimes that happens as we're trying to balance that, meet the needs of everybody in different ways. And the demands, our patrons can sometimes be very demanding. So what does the title mean in your policies? Is it understandable to your patrons? Every title should be reviewed in your policies, not just the policy itself. If we share our policies with the public, they have no clue what a circulation policy is unless they've got some prior knowledge behind that, and other policies that might be just confusing to them unless the policy name kind of tells them what it's about. So our policies are meant to guide us in our work, and they should reflect our communities and our patrons. So why do we have policy? We want to protect our staff. As I mentioned before, we also want to protect our patrons. Sorry, I've got to move my papers here. I've got to balance my screens and my written notes here. So they serve a number of purposes, and typically when I do slides, I didn't tell you this, I've told Jean I'm pretty informal, and when I do slides, they're usually just something for you to look at, so you don't have to look at me while I'm just blathering to you, especially in an online format. But I've kind of tried to create slides that give you some information that you can just not have to take so many notes. So policy as protect our staff, they protect our public. They are the primary tool that our staff can use to do their jobs. So our state library in Iowa requires that we have some specific policies. We have to have a circulation policy, as I mentioned. We have to have a collection development policy and internet use policy as part of our accreditation programs. So outside those requirements, do we have other entities that require certain policies? Our cities require policies. They help us guide customer service. They help educate the public on how the library operates. They cover us legally and ethically. They lend credibility to our organization and make us look stronger if we're prepared to deal with such things as challenges in our collection. They're also a mechanism for administration and staff to translate library priorities into action as we're working through strategic planning and other plans for the library. and they support our staff and our board in the event that legal action does come about. So I think the main one that I want to, I'm going to keep hammering away at it. They protect our staff. I think having strong policy that lets our staff do their job but still protects them in doing that job is vital. Our policy should also ensure that our customers are receiving consistent and quality service. So that's how we're protecting the public with our policies. When staff follow policy, when they deliver service, we know that our organization is going to be more credible. We aren't randomly making decisions with no merit. So as you're researching policies, which is super exciting, policy development, the book that I'll refer to at the end is about building policies that you've maybe read, the planning process policies. A purpose statement is really important. Every one of our policies has a purpose statement. Why is this policy in place? What's the philosophy behind it? Some of you may have all 4 of these elements in every single policy. We do not have all of them. Our policies do not contain our procedures. The procedure is the policy for a policy is how the process is operating and the services that you're providing. That's the process. That's what your staff needs to know to guide them in doing the service. We don't include that in our policies because that's the back end of things for us. It helps to provide the delivery of service, but our patrons don't need to know that end of things. They need to know our regulations or rules. And then the last piece is the guidelines. Some of our policies do have guidelines and some don't. We sort of differentiate that by policies that include guidelines because they're more participatory in nature. So such things as collection development policy, when someone needs to know how to request a materials purchase or what happens when our donations come in, then we'll have guidelines included in our policy to help them understand that decision-making process in more detail. Another example of that is our art policy, so that when we display local artists, they know what to expect from our policy and our decisions when we're deciding who's going to display and how that will look. So strategies for developing your policies. I mentioned earlier, and I'm going to feel it merits again, I'm going to say it over and over again, policy protects the staff and policy helps protect our patrons. So local application and decision making is very, very important. Each one of our communities, whether you have 1,000 people in your community or 70,000, there are certain decisions that are really localized depending on who you're serving and how your service methods are delivered. Does our staff understand our policies? Do they understand the intent of our policies? And do they understand if there's a legal or ethical reason for having a policy? I suggest using really good positive language that's proactive and not punitive, but also very inclusive. And hopefully that will help our patrons understand their intent as well. Are your policies available to your patrons? We have our policies on our website, and those update every month because our board does review policy every month to ensure that they are continuing to be equitable and consistent with our service model and consistent with other policies and practices that we have. I suggest writing your policy in a way that's flexible, but also protects your staff. So that's the piece for me, is that allowing my staff to make decisions within the policy, not outside the boundaries of the policy, but still being able to be flexible in their decision-making practices as they're working with our patrons. And seeking best practices. So where can you find good policy? There's a lot of policies online. I have specific other libraries that I know have great policy that I think is really strong that I'll go to if I'm looking to edit a policy or update a policy. And then finally, the policy that we have is only as good as how we train our staff. If our staff aren't trained to follow policy and aren't trained to understand policy, then it's not going to be an effective policy. And setting a review schedule, it depends on, our state requires each policy be reviewed at least once every 3 years. Our library board has chosen to review policy each month, so we get through all of our policies in 1 year and start it all over. And I'm surprised every year that we, even if we just find a grammatical error, there's always a small tweak to almost every policy that we have, but it's a pretty efficient process. So if anyone has questions, please feel free to chime in, or suggestions or comments. I feel like I'm just talking at a screen. It's really weird to be in this virtual world that we're in right now. So feel free to chime in if you would like. These are just some of the limitations of policy development. Some of our policy development can be more difficult depending on your library board structure. When I talk about our policy, it comes from a really flexible position. I, as a librarian or as a director, have full authority because our board is advisory. So my boss is actually my city administrator. I report directly to the city administrator, and our board each month, they do approve policy, but it still has to go through city council for final approval each month, and they give me full authority over those policies. So is your board on board? Is your staff on board? Are your policies consistent? And are you providing the training that you need to provide to help your staff understand? Each time we submit a policy to the board for a review, my staff has read it and looked it over before the board meeting. Every month I send all of the policies that are up for review to our staff, and I ask them to respond that they've read it, or if they have suggestions for updates or edits to the policy. That just helps me ensure that they're on top of it and they know what's going on with our policies. When we hire, obviously each person is onboarded and has to read through our entire policy manual, which is not always a really fun thing to do. But it does help us ensure that they've read it and they know it, but that doesn't ensure that they continue to remember what's in policy. So having those policies shared on a monthly basis helps me ensure that they've kept up with what's going on. When I started as director, I reviewed the entire set of policies over about the course of about a year, and realized that we had a lot of outdated policies and policies that were just no longer applicable. We had a no cell phone policy in 2014 that just didn't make sense anymore to have, as people operate with their cell phones as part of their daily life. Most people have them Velcroed to their hands. So banning their use is really difficult when they need them to conduct business, access information. And in fact, we're getting ready to launch a library app where they can check out their books using their cell phone. So we do not want to limit their use in the library. So
Jennie, I have
yes.
a couple of questions for you.
Sure.
The first is, you mentioned some of the libraries that you go to for when you are looking to update policies. Can you share some of the libraries that you recommend for good policies? And if you
Sure.
want, I can get that afterwards too. So
you bet. Remember that I'm in Iowa, so a lot of mine are in Iowa here. I look to the Des Moines Public Library, the Ames Public Library, Iowa City here near us here. They're all bigger libraries than us, and Cedar Rapids also. Then outside of Iowa, I love the Minneapolis area, their Hennepin County. I look at their policies quite often, and King County over on the West Coast are some of them that I'll go to, just knowing that Ames is really strong. I really like their policies a lot.
Okay. Thank you. I will. I think I caught them all. I'll put them in the chat for everyone. Thank you for sharing those. And then another question is, I try to write policies in clear, simple terms that are user-friendly. A board member has been asking that they go to the city attorney, the policies, and they come back long and full of legalese. How do I convince the board that this makes the policies less effective?
I mean, I think it's just I would agree. In fact, we have a new city attorney. I'll tell you a quick side story before I answer that. And our old city attorney was very much like that. He would send me these long, I don't send policy to him. The only policy that our city attorney has seen or sees, well, he actually took it upon himself to look at all our policies. Our new one did, but we have a really good rapport, and I was able to talk him down a little bit. But is the sex offender policy. I want to make sure that that is clearly legal, and I don't mind legalese in that policy, because I wanted to make sure our library is well protected when it comes to that policy, because it's part of the law. And then I did have him look over our operational policy, just for the piece about, like, we're not returning materials and how we handle We don't charge fines at the library, but we do charge cost of materials. So he looked that one over too. I would highly suggest to your library board that most of your policies, I mean, you want them to stand up legally, but most of your policies are not going to be affected by any legal, unless they are. I wouldn't recommend sending them to the board or to your attorney. Your policies are library driven and patron driven, not court driven. You know, certain policies, you want to make sure that if someone's challenging material in the library, that you need to know the law and what's behind, you know, each one of your policies, especially the things like that where there could be where it's something that could go to court or something that could be challenged legally, such as collection development question or something in your collection that someone doesn't like a challenge. You need to know those laws. But I don't think having narrative, these big, long, crazy legal rhetoric is going to help anyone. Your staff won't understand them. So how are they going to deliver good service if they don't even understand the policy that they're trying to deliver? And your patrons certainly won't understand them. You want your patrons to feel welcome. And if policies aren't welcoming and they're written in such a way that, you know, someone with a not necessarily a high degree of reading level is going to understand, I wouldn't recommend it. If you can talk them out of that, I would say, I don't know exactly how you convince your board of that, but I would use those things. You want your policies to be welcome to your patrons and accessible to your staff.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I think so. If there's any clarification, go ahead.
All right. So let's see if I can find my spot again here. Sorry. So the other limitations, just I think narrative format's really important. And so we'll just segue right into that. And is it a positive policy that's not punitive? If they're poorly written or difficult to understand, then they're not accessible, as we just kind of said. And then if they're written in a narrative form, that doesn't separate the components into the statement, regulations, procedures, and guidelines, they're going to be very limiting. Do they conflict with your laws? And that's where it's important for us to know the laws and maybe to have that discussion with your lawyers. But if your lawyer gets involved to the point where they're making them not easy to understand, then we're not doing a service to our community or our staff. If they contradict each other, that's another problem. We've had that where even in the same policy, we've had contradicting elements as we were going through and adjusting our policies. We found things that were just like, whoa, these two things contradict each other within the policy. Or if one policy doesn't flow with another policy, you're going to have some problems. So the best decision-making model is to estimate, implement, check, and adjust, and then estimate, implement, plan, and adjust again. That is from Creating Policies for Results, which is the book that I was stumbling through and it wasn't coming to my brain as I was talking about it earlier. It's a great book. It really helps you apply your policy to your library and how your operations, how you deliver service. So we want our policies to reflect best practices, but we also want them to reflect our community. I would argue that excellence is defined locally to match our needs, our interests, and the priorities of our community and residents and the larger entity which we serve. So do they match your city? It's really important here that our city administrator has over and over again said, you know, we are part of the big picture. Each department represents the city, and if we don't reflect our city as a whole, we're not doing a very good service. It doesn't require unlimited resources. Policy making is a moving target. It changes all the time. Let me say that again. It's a moving target. Library policy is generally affected by changes in our priorities, such as our long-term plans, our strategic planning, and it's imperative that our policies keep flowing with that they're current, and that's why it comes back to that, having that regular review schedule in play. We do a review schedule I can share that with anybody who wants. I can send it to Gene. It's pretty simple. It's just a table. I can share a Google Drive to it if you'd like. It just basically tells you what policy is going to be in place. And you'll note when you look at that is that we have a staff intro schedule. So each month we have staff come to our board meeting and do a little 15 or 20-minute sort of training with our board. It might be how they facilitate a program. It might be something about a policy specific thing, or some library. We have to have board trainings each month, and since our board is advisory, it makes it a little difficult to train them in governing type things. So in Iowa, there's only 2 of us that have advisory boards, which makes that challenging. And they all express that they would love to have the staff come and talk about operations, how they work, how we provide service. So each month we do that. And we try to match those to the staff to an interesting policy that affects how they work. So when they're there, they can also make suggestions for those policy changes. The state library does require us to do that policy review, as I mentioned, every 3 years, and that we do it every year. At the beginning, it was a really tedious process to do that. It's become fairly easy for us to get through all of them, and it doesn't take very long. So why do we review them annually? It keeps our staff and our board knowledgeable about the policies that we have, and it ensures that changes that we make in our services, which are constant, are reflected in our policies.
Hi, Jenny.
So
Can I ask a question as you are transitioning? And you might be covering this later, so if you are, let me know. The question is, can you talk about creating policies to ensure staff are meeting job expectations? Is that a policy that you have?
So personnel policy, our personnel policy is actually part of our city. We follow personnel policy, so I am definitely not going to be someone who's going to be able to talk very expertly about that, but I can tell you for us, our personnel policy covers every aspect of the work they do, and making sure that they're, timely in their work, that they're getting their work done, that they're following city policy, also not just library policy, and then just making them accountable to that personnel policy is really important. I think you need to be careful not to box them in. I really think that personnel policies need to reflect state regulations. And then, I mean, if you're talking about ensuring that they're actually doing their jobs, I think that's more of a management tool that you should be using, and not necessarily a policy. Certainly you want your policies to be a frame of reference for that, but I see that as a management issue. Are you doing regular evaluations with your staff? We do evaluations every year, but then I have meetings, regular meetings with each member of my staff, and it's time consuming, but I sit down with every one of my staff several times a year, typically at least quarterly, if not more often, to just talk about where they are and how they're doing, so that they are never surprised by anything that comes up in those reviews, as we all know that that's really important. Mm-hmm. Did that answer that for you, or?
Thank you. I will let you know, but I think so. And then I just had one follow-up question to the libraries that you look at for policies. Do you have any suggestions for smaller libraries that you look at, or?
Mine, no.
Yeah, well, I was going to suggest that.
Here in Iowa, I would say Ankeny. They're not super small. They're kind of about the same size as we are. I think Ankeny does things really well. Trying to think.
That's okay. And if you think of some afterwards, you can always let me know and we can share that. So
yeah, I'd have to go and look. I'm sure there are wonderful smaller libraries. I just am not in tune with them as much now. Okay. So
thank you.
Yes. So I talked about procedures earlier. We used procedures completely incorrectly before I was director. I didn't know that. I want to talk a little bit about the slide that's in front of you. It kind of shows you just the transition from our policies prior to 2014, before I was director, and then to the makeover that we did. So we had 17 policies. We now have 13, and actually we're going to reintroduce a program policy as we do a lot of programming. And I just spoke with another librarian at another library who made some really valid points. I had kind of bucked having one of those because I like our programmers to have a lot of free reign, but I saw her points, which were mainly just protecting the staff and ensuring that we're being equitable in our programming and inclusive. So I think we're going to reintroduce that policy, so there will be 14 again. It's not done yet. But you can see that the name changes are something I'd really want to point out. We had what we called an operational policy, which is now a service policy. That makes a little more sense to the public. In my opinion, our collection development combines multiple policies now. The gift and donation, the reconsideration, and materials and selection are all part of that collection development policy. And then we have a community center. We're part of a large building. We have a rec center, two pools, a communications department, and the library all in the same building. So we had what was called the community center discipline policy, and unattended safety child policy. We have now changed that to child safety policy. And we sort of broke away from them. I just was not thrilled with the policy that the rec department wanted. It was very punitive, and it still is. So we broke off and have our own child safety policy. They did change the name of theirs, and it's a little more nicely worded now. That's my happy ending to that story. And then we have a meeting room terms of use policy. Then we no longer have a notices and displays policy. That's covered in our service policy. So a lot of things we just wanted to make them more succinct. We wanted to make them, like I said, palatable for our public and for our staff. So that is why that looks the way it looks now. So we have 13, almost 14. And like I said, our personnel policy, I did mention that here is just part of our state requirement that we have one. So we have a personnel policy statement in our policy manual that just basically says we follow the city's personnel policy. The new policies that we added and updated, as I mentioned, were the child safety policy. That one, to me, is really important. We wanted to ensure that kids felt really welcome here and that parents knew that they were safe when they were in the building. I'll just mention it briefly, we've changed our child safety policy in the last 2 years. We used to have, kids had to be in 5th grade or older to come in the library alone. Today, kids can come in the library at any age as long as they can consistently follow our rules. Sometimes it takes a few bumps to get them there. If we notice on a given day that the same kiddo is having struggles over and over again, then that kiddo is sent home with a copy of our child safety policy, and their parents are then contacted and asked to send them back in 6 months to try again. We know that every kiddo is different, and sometimes a 5-year-old behaves much better than a 15-year-old. So we want to make sure that we work within those boundaries. And if they're requiring a lot of staff time, that's basically when we know that they maybe need to go home for a while and come back when they're a little bit more mature.
Okay, can I ask you a quick question before you transition again? Sorry about that. I meant to get you earlier.
No.
So the question is about the cell phone policy, about what was outdated about the cell phone policy, and is it rolled into the technology policy now?
So we have nothing about cell phones in our policies at all. It's a procedure. Basically, if someone is being super loud or disruptive, it's basically part of our conduct policy. If someone, no matter whether it's a cell phone or it's a group of moms chatting loudly or a group of kiddos being noisy, it's the same basic principles or procedures. We're going to ask them to, give them a warning, ask them to lower their voices, ask them to, if the call is long or it's disruptive, we're going to ask them to take that call to a different area of the library or outside. But we don't have any cell phone policy at all.
Okay, thank you. And then another question is, in your policies, do you use the term patron? Do you have a preference for this term? The question attendees says, I use library user or customer. She just was wondering about terminology for what you use.
Yes, you know, we do use patron. I'm not thrilled with it. I think this is an always something that we can discuss over and over again. I like library user. I think that's a great term. And customer is also great. I think any of them, whatever works, we just use patron here.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's all the questions at the moment. Thank you.
All right. So this is obviously for us in our pretty local. This is the role of the city or county in your policies. You can substitute county if it fits better for your area. We in Iowa, I don't know how many Iowans are on the call, but in Iowa, we have over 500 libraries that are almost all standalones. There are a few groups of libraries that work together. Scott County has a county system, and then the Metro Library, which is but they're all standalones too. Cedar Rapids, Hiawatha, Marion, they work well together, but they're not a county system. So we don't have a lot of that. So we're all pretty independent. So I'm using the word city here for our policies, and since our library is a city department. So I can't talk to you about the countywide perspective since I have never worked in a county library. So if anybody has anything to add or suggestions when I say stuff, please feel free to chime in on that. All I really want to say here is that your policies should reflect your community and that larger entity and your constituents that you're serving in your community, whether they're patrons or library users. So our city employees, our overarching vision and goals, our personnel, our holidays, our inclement weather, those are all things that you're going to want to look at depending on where you live. We also follow our inclement weather policy as just part of our city's policy. That was not actually my decision. That was our city administrator's decision to take that out. Since we're in a bigger building now, a bigger facility than we were when we started off, it's a little harder for us to close if the weather is bad. We look at a lot of different factors, and we work with our roads guys, our streets guys, and our city administrator before we make a determination about library closings for weather. And this can be difficult. It's not easy when there's so many underlying factors and you're deciding, and I would just conjecture that social climate and shifts in your population can also impact your policy development. We've definitely seen that here as we've grown. So where do your roles lie? So as I mentioned, our board is advisory. So again, that comes from that place, but also just generally from, I think your board should understand the big picture implications. And this might go back to the question that someone had about the lawyer, getting your lawyer or your city attorney involved. I think this is really important. They do want to ensure that the policies are legal and ethical, that they're compliant with that. But they also need to understand those bigger picture implications. If your policies are worded in legalese, then most of your patrons, a majority of your patrons and your underserved populations are not going to understand them. And then hopefully your board is improving your policy statements and your regulations. For the director's role, in my opinion, is to bring the policy review to the board and act as the technical advisor. So again, I think that as you send policy to your attorney, that starts to look, and I hate the word, it's such a catchphrase, but micromanage. I don't think that your board should micromanage that. You are the expert in your library's operations, and your board is there to help you and guide you in those operations. But bottom line is, you're the one that does the day-to-day. So I think it's important for us to be the ones who are delivering and drafting those new policies and addressing new issues that come about that maybe we need to take a look at, a review a policy or add something to a policy. So here, like I said, our policies are approved at the board level, but ultimately it's the city council's decision to approve policy. They take a look at my policy manual maybe once a year if I bring it to them. The city council, as I mentioned, gives me pretty much carte blanche to develop the policies as we think is important to run our library and operate. So I take my recommendations and staff recommendations to the board, And so the board, the staff, and I all review policy about a week before the board meeting, and then we all come together. I come to the board with the recommendations. And as I mentioned, if I think a policy needs to be reviewed for legal, to be sound legally, or as our board bylaws should, then I bring it to our city attorney, and he'll, and I actually said this, I forgot this was in my notes. He does go a little overboard. I just try not to show him too much. So the board has great eyes on as community representatives, and that's really how we should use that board. They can point out things that might need to be clarified into layman's terms. So going back to, again, to that question about legal, you want them to be understandable. So what about your staff? The staff are your cogs. They make everything function. If you're on a solo library, obviously you're that cog. But if you have staff, it's really important that they understand and are on board with your policies. They understand why you have policies in place, and then they be included. In my opinion, they should be included in the development and editing process. And this goes down for us to the staff who work only 10 hours a week or 9 hours a week. I want all of our staff to understand policy, and those frontline staff are my eyes. They're the ones who know what's going to work and maybe what might be really challenging for them. So they're trained to utilize policy and they know when it's acceptable here to be flexible. So let me clarify, if you are a one-person show, you still owe it to yourself to have flexible fluid policies. And as a big, huge library, hopefully you're able to do that as well. They help you do your job efficiently and effectively, and that's really the purpose of policy. So for example, our staff has been growing, and we started to realize that we had not been doing well with training our part-time evening and weekend staff to know how to follow the policies. So that's where we started to have them read all the policies, but there was still no follow-through with ensuring that they understood the policies and how they applied. So we started doing more training on those things as part of their onboarding, so that they can understand more how to apply policy to their work, and even some role playing in some cases. So just some more places that you can find sample policies. ALA guidelines to policy development is a great place to look. Also Web Junction, they have topic areas in management where you can find policies. Our state library has a whole policy thing, and then other libraries that are like your library or your size. I think part of that's just getting familiar with the libraries around you, and if you know librarians who you think just got it, that they do it really well, I would suggest starting with those libraries. If you know libraries that are just really outstanding, I'd go to them, because I'm guessing that they probably have good policies back in them. The other thing I would mention here, and it's fairly new, that I don't have on this, I haven't updated it, is the Colorado has a group called CLIC. The Colorado Libraries, I can't remember what the I stands for, but it's a consortium, and they have a whole policies as well, because she actually asked me for my policies, so I know that they're there. So it's capital C, capital L, small I, capital C. And then this is just a page of the resources that the creating policies for results, which I used. I mentioned that I go to other libraries a lot for policy. Obviously, another resource are people, your board and your staff and your city attorney are also resources, but I don't have them listed here. This is just what I used to create this slideshow. And then our policy manual is available on our website, which is northlibertylibrary.org. And I can certainly share a copy of or a link to our policy manual and to the what did I mention before that I would share with you, Jean? I've forgotten.
Your schedule for reviewing.
Yes, sorry.
Yes. That's all right.
It's pretty good timing. If anybody has questions for me, any more questions, or just want to have a conversation about policy a little bit, I am at the end of my slideshow.
Awesome. Thank you. So if anyone does have any further questions, feel free to put them in the question box. So let's see. There, Anne mentioned, and Anne is helping me out behind the scenes. I can't talk this morning. You were mentioning the city attorney, and she said in some cases city attorney work can be expensive for small libraries, but it's very crucial for specific policies. I think it depends on the relationship in Wisconsin, at least between the library and their municipalities. So, yes.
That's our city attorney is actually a city department, so he doesn't charge us, which is lovely.
Yes. Thank you. The comment came in that she's a new library director and this information is very valuable to me. So I really appreciated hearing about training for library staff on your policies, and you mentioned role playing. So how do you incorporate the training both for your staff and for the library board? Because you mentioned you have staff kind of do a little bit of the training. So is that one of the ways that you incorporate training on the policies overall?
When we onboard, we've just periodically have training in the library where we've actually and we haven't done it for a while with COVID. It's been we've a little bit been thrown off, but we've brought in, for instance, when for fines, just having conversations about how do you address a situation and now we don't have fines anymore, but if you have a frustrated patron or you're having a confrontation. So we've had people come in and talked about how to deal with confrontation and conflict with with patrons coming in the library, angry patrons. I do ask all of our staff to take advantage of webinars and free resources such as Web Junction and do regular trainings. We keep a dashboard of all of our staff trainings. I also, we subscribe to Ryan Dowd's homelessness training, and all of our staff down to the part-timers are required to take that training when they are onboarded. As part of their, so then we offer anytime. If someone's like, I could really use some help, someone will be happy to do some role playing with them. The one thing we did secondary trauma training last year where one of our staff and a social work intern we had did some training with us, and then we did some role playing and broke out into groups, and it was really helpful.
Excellent. Thank you. I have a question just one second. In regards to flexibility and policy implementation, how do you handle staff differences in policy flexibility? When some staff strictly enforce policies and other staff are more flexible, it can seem to patrons that policy enforcement is inconsistent and maybe inequitable.
So we have a lot of conversations about this. I think we did run into a little bit of that when we had fines still, so what we did was kind of create parameters, and those are in our procedures and our trainings. I started to tell this and I didn't finish it. We used to use our procedures in this way. If we had some new rule we wanted to create, or we didn't want to make a policy, but we wanted staff to follow a certain thing, and this was before I was director, we would just create a new procedure. And then we'd tell staff to do it a certain way. That is not really a good thing to do. It actually creates a lot of inconsistency. So our procedures are really where we try to make sure that staff is consistent in how they do things. So when we had our fines, we had a thing where staff could waive up to $10 worth of fines on someone's card. And they don't get to just randomly do that. They don't get to say, well, I don't like this person, so I'm not waiving their fines. It was every patron. We kind of just made it this, and we started with just a conscience box, and say, you can, your fines are under $10. We're going to delete them today, but if you want to donate to the library, feel free. Things like that. But it's really about conversation and training. Those are the keys to making sure you're consistent. And I think there's always going to be even if you have strict policies and you're asking your staff to follow super strict policies, we're all human. I'm just going to throw it out there that we are always going to have some inconsistency in how we deal with every patron, because each transaction is different. And each person handles things differently. But our hope is to be as consistent as possible. And I think the key to that is training.
Thank you. Let's see. Another question was, if you would share your onboarding process document, but I will follow up with you for a couple of those other links as well. So if you're willing to share that or a process, that would be awesome. And another question is, what does your policy workflow look like? For instance, once a policy is approved and tweaked by the board, what do you do to record and communicate the policy?
So we do, as I mentioned, we always send them out to everyone. Once the policy is approved at the board meeting, I write myself a note so I don't forget to go and update the policy, honestly. And then I send it to our marketing coordinator, and she puts it up on the website in the policy manual. And then we just let the staff know that the policy is updated there. At this point, if we have a big change in a policy, then it's brought up at a staff meeting where we have regular staff meetings, and those are then addressed at staff meetings, so everyone's on board. We have staff meetings for our full-time, and then our part-time have a staff meeting as well, a separate staff meeting as well. So when they have that information is all relayed.
Mm-hmm. A question, what is your staff size? I don't remember if you had mentioned that at the beginning.
We have 17 on staff. We have 10 full-time and 7 part-time.
Okay, thank you. And another question, can you talk about the difference between policy and procedures?
So your policies are your rules. They are your guiding factors. They're helping you set the tone for what happens in your library. And then the procedures are your staff guidance. They're the down and dirty. This is how this is going to be handled. I'm trying to find my notes so I can make sure I'm telling you exactly what. So the policy is like the philosophy. Why are we doing this? Here's the rules and how we follow it. Here's the practices that we utilize. And then the procedures are the process for how we offer those services. So the procedures on my side thing are the frontline end of things. They're what the staff need to know to ensure that those consistent policies are being handled, or so the policies are being handled consistently.
Thank you. Another comment and question. Thanks so much, Jenny. One question and a comment. I did want to ask if you think meeting room policies and privacy policies should also be grouped with the sex offender policies, and that they need to include legalese. And then her side comment is, she said, though I've lived in Wisconsin for 30 years, I grew up in Dubuque. So another
Awesome. Awesome. I have not had our attorney review our meeting room policy, but I actually have discussed it with him, mainly because we don't allow any money to be exchanged in our meeting rooms. We don't allow for-profit use of our meeting rooms or business use of our meeting rooms. So to make sure that I worded that strong in a way that was keeping the staff, so the staff understood it, and so our patrons understood that they, I'm sure that there are still people who do it, but we don't have somebody coming in and selling Pampered Chef in our meeting rooms. But we also wanted to make sure that our staff could, say, host an author and sell their books at their events. So there's some little nuances there that you want to tweak, but I don't personally have them lumped together with quite that amount of legalese, but I think you could, depending on what your meeting room policies are and how stringent they are.
Thank you. That is all the questions that we have so far. If we have any last minute questions, we have a few minutes left. So let me. And Jenny, it's another Jenny, follows up on that. She said we've had a neo-Nazi group in Wisconsin try to use meeting rooms. So I think that's where the question came from.
And I think the one thing we need to remember is, horrible as that's a really hard one, because boy, we don't want those folks in there. But then how do we make sure we're being equitable in what we're offering? Where's the boundary? How do you say, well, you can't use the room? The one thing that I think is really important, at least in Iowa, if someone's having a meeting in a library, it's a public meeting, no matter who it is. So anybody who has a meeting here, they don't ever know it, but those meetings are open to anyone. Anyone can go into a meeting here, and they can't exclude anyone. So that's kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I will tell you guys, this is totally an aside, that's a scary situation. I don't know how you keep that from happening. And without having some whether they could cry discrimination or not, that would be something I would definitely bring to your city attorney in that case. But I love to talk about this stuff, and I love just to talk about librarianship in general. My phone numbers and my email are both on this slide. Feel free to reach out to me anytime. I am passionate about libraries. I never get tired of these conversations, so I am always available to talk.
Thank you. And comment on the previous question. He says it's the same rule for Wisconsin. Any meeting space is public. So yes, so we have the same rule here in Wisconsin.
And I don't think that most people probably know that when they book meetings.
Yes, or they overlook that fine print on the meeting form that they filled out.
Right. And the bottom line really is most of our patrons, the majority of our patrons are going to go through their entire library experience and their entire career of using libraries without ever looking at any of our policies or caring.
Mm-hmm.
Really, really.
Mm-hmm. If there are any last questions, we have about 3 minutes left before 11:30. Otherwise, I might let you go a couple minutes early. We'll give just a minute for last minute questions to come in. Let everybody type.
But anyone who knows me knows that I rarely have time left over when I'm talking.
Yes. All right. We will just wait just a second. The final comment following up on the other one is so much of policy is dealing with, you mentioned that most library patrons won't see it. The comment is so much of policy is dealing with that 3% of jerks.
That is also very valid and true. And on that note, I will tell you the thing that makes me happy, because I didn't know if I was muted or not before, is that I have adult children who are lovely. And my daughter just lives in Arizona and just told us last night that she's going to start a chair rental for her hair business. Awesome. And my son and his wife just reached out to ask if they could take me out to a quiet afternoon lunch on Saturday for my birthday. So those things make me happy.
Ah, that's really nice. And happy early birthday.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I think on that note, we will close it up for today. So thank you so much, Jennie, for a great session. We really appreciated having you here today. Thank you. As mentioned, the session recording and slides will be posted on the conference website by Friday, January 29th. There will be a short survey that will show up on your screen after we end today, and it will also be emailed to you. We really appreciate your feedback. Our next session in this track is Library Director Jenga, the Perpetual Challenge with Kate Hall and Kathy Parker, and begins at 1 p.m. Central Time. We hope to see you there. And if not, have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all.